We love our Greek produce at Ouzo Talk, but it hasn't always been easy to get a hold of. That's why you should check out the Greek Providore. From unique wines and spirits to herbs, spices, sweets, cookbooks, gifts, and so much more, there's genuinely no better place to find products sourced directly from premium producers in Greece online. Whether it's for your own pantry or you're looking for a special gift, the Greek Providore has you covered. Visit thegreekprovidore.com.au to check out their range. The Greek Providore, proud sponsors of this episode of Ouzo Talk.
Sound is.
Nick Athanasiou, mate, this is my favourite time of year, honestly, because we get to do some amazing things on this podcast, but between you and I, we just love the history episodes that we do here, don't we?
100%. I like to say it's great when you're here, but it's even better when we've got amazing guests like the one you can introduce to us.
Our conversations between the two of us when it comes to history, they're always interesting. They're probably ill-informed. There's a lot of crap that goes between you and I. We try to keep it as academic as possible, but again, we're not academics, so that's why we enlist the help of the best. And true to form, we have the best again with us, so I'm going to try and bury the lead again, just to build the suspense a little bit, but let me introduce you to him because we've got him for a little bit. Our guest today is A.G. Levendis, Professor of Greek Culture Emeritus in the Faculty of Classics at the University of Cambridge, and is a Senior Research Fellow at Clare College, Cambridge. His main areas of interest are ancient Greek history and culture, in particular that of Athens and Sparta. He has a new book coming out in the next year about Pericles, which is why he's here to talk to us today, in fact. And I'm sure it's going to be another spoiler-free episode of Ouzo Talk. Not going to spoil the book at all. So joining us from Cambridge for his third episode of Ouzo Talk, welcome Professor Paul Cartledge.
Hello, Nick and Tom. It is a little bit early for me because we had to put it forward an hour, but I'm so pleased to see you and thank you for inviting me. Let's hope it's third time lucky, eh?
You're being far too modest because honestly, we get so much mail about the episodes that you're on. People writing and asking questions. Not at all.
No, the opposite, in fact. But we're actually getting high school teachers and students reaching out to us now as well. So
that's the idea, isn't it?
It is. And they're using our podcast as a term of reference as well now.
They are. And the only reason why we can do that is because there's credibility with people such as Paul. And I mean, that's a good way to segue to the fact that we do actually have a couple of questions from two schools here in Sydney who have history departments, obviously. So a question on Pericles, some about broader ancient Greek history as well, which you won't be out of your depth with by any means, let me just say. But again, Paul, thank you so much for being here. And we are here to talk about Pericles, aren't we?
We are indeed. Great man. And I hope we'll be able to find something new to say about him. And this is the problem, isn't it, when you have a great man. But on the other hand, he was controversial in his day, and he is controversial, therefore, still today. And if I were to give you just one analogy, not an Australian one, but a Commonwealth one, it would be Winston Churchill. So in Winston Churchill's lifetime, he went through a lot of different phases, and he made some terrible mistakes. And yet, for one thing, and that is, of course, the Second World War, resisting to fascism and Hitler and so on, he is, I think, rightly recognised as great. And the word great is problematic. I don't know if this is something that you think about, but Alexander the Great, well, clearly he did many, many great things. He's someone we've talked about before. But on the other hand, he did some really bad things as well. So great people sometimes are said to be great because they're, in a way, different from the rest of us. They're above us. They're sort of superhuman. But that does put a responsibility upon them to do rather better, to be a better type of human being than they would be if they were just like you, dare I say you and us. And so let's hit the road.
It's interesting that you mentioned Winston Churchill. Let me just ask something because, I mean, even in this day and age, we're seeing a fair amount of revisionist history happening around Winston Churchill. I mean, this is about someone who is within the lifetime of many people that are still around now. How hard is it to avoid revisionism when it comes to someone like Pericles?
Well, you use the word revisionism, and that, of course, is a technical term, and it means that you have an established picture of someone, which might be nuanced, but there's a dominant type of view of someone, let's say crudely good or bad. And then a bunch of people come along, typically spearheaded by one historian, and they want to revise the general picture on the grounds that they believe the general picture is significantly false either in fact or in opinion. So Churchill was controversial, almost deliberately so, from the word go, because he was, like my character Pericles, he was an eccentric, he was an aristocrat. So was Pericles. From the top drawer, actually went to a school where the first Duke of Marlborough came to study, and Churchill's older brother was the Duke of Marlborough. He was the second son, so he didn't become the Duke, but he was an aristocrat from the top drawer. Therefore, he had certain connections, certain views, and for much of his lifetime, those views were normal in regards to especially the empire and race. But after the Second World War, his great moment, the world changed. Empire became a dirty word. Racism of all sorts was abhorred. And Churchill, looking back on his views and some of the things he did in his offices, he was prime minister several times, and he held other very high offices of state. They were thought to be disreputable and, in fact, to some people, disgusting. So there's a case of somebody who was revision was, if you like, inevitable because the world changed. Now, Pericles lived and died ages ago. So it's much more an internal thing among specialist historians. And only secondarily is it the case that politicians today, you perhaps know of one, a recent prime minister of ours who's a great fan both of Churchill and of Pericles, they come along and they apply Pericles as an analogy. They say, I'm pretty good, you know, I'm sort of like Pericles. Well, some of us say, oh my God, you know, that's false. Nobody today can be quite like a character from a totally different world and civilization. And secondly, anyway, you, this particular recent politician, is nowhere near as admirable as Pericles in certain respects, at any rate, was. So revisionism, you're quite right, is the order of the day. And in a way, it's natural. It's a sort of evolutionary thing about historiography, that is, the writing of history. If historians merely repeated what their predecessors have said, well, they're not exactly going to be advancing either their own careers or the study of history. But more importantly, the world changes so that what we think today is important is not what perhaps our parents thought, or the way we see the same thing differs because we are from different generations. So what I'm trying to capture in the book is precisely this revisionist mood and moment without totally overthrowing any particular vision of the man that people have had or put forward before.
I think that's a great spoiler-free review of the book.
That's brilliant.
See you later, Paul. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, well, I needn't bother to say another word. Just read the book.
That's right. Well, we'll hold on to you just for a little while longer because Pericles is obviously someone who is hugely important in Athenian and Greek history. So without any further ado, shall we do the honours, Nick?
Definitely. I've already had one, but let's have a drink.
Yeah, no. Have another on me.
Yamas.
Yamas.
Welcome, Paul. I'm sure you've got your Earl Grey there this morning.
Absolutely. You're right. That's what we drink.
Is it really? Got it in one.
It is. Got it in one. Yep.
Fantastic. All right. Well
done.
Well, perhaps we should start at the very beginning.
Yes.
A very good place to start.
Who was Pericles?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So who was he, and what do we know about him as an individual, his family, and his background?
Well, I'll give you his full name, that is his full official name. And all Athenians had 3 names, all male Athenians, that is. Remember, this is a very sex-divided society, and men rule. I mean, men literally rule. Women don't have the vote, for example. But without a mother, you can't come into the world. And interestingly, one of the things Pericles did was make mothers of Athenian men even more important than they had been before, because he proposed a law whereby your mother had to be Athenian as well as your dad for you to become a legitimate free Athenian citizen. But that's in the future, so he was then in his 40s. But he was born, we think, round about 495. And to give him his full 3 names, he was Pericles, and of course the accent's on the last, Xanthippou of Xanthippus, that means son of Xanthippus, of the deme, and demos means the place where he's registered, Cholagos, and the adjective of that is Cholagius. So he's Pericles Xanthippou Cholagius, and that appears on a particular type of evidence which is very relevant to him. If I use the word ostrakon, does that mean anything? It's a potsherd. Yes. It's a potsherd, and from that word we get the expression, it's from the ancient Greek, ostracism, ostrakismos, which was a very strange procedure to boot out a politician that the majority of the voters, and there had to be 6,000 voters, and so the candidate who got the most negative votes was exiled for 10 years, had to go outside Athens and Attiki, which is the region round Athens, and didn't lose civic rights but couldn't exercise them. Wasn't deprived of property but couldn't exercise property because he was outside the bounds of the city-state. So in 484, when Pericles was about 11, his dad was ostracized. Now that tells you 2 things, really. One, that Pericles comes from a very prominent family, because not just anybody would be a candidate for ostracism, but secondly, that Xanthippus was controversial, that there were enough Athenians who didn't like him, that they wanted him booted out. And I think, we're not absolutely clear, but the issue of the day was, what line should we take on the Persians? So the Persians have invaded us in 490, when Pericles was about 5. Battle of Marathon, that I think probably most people have heard of. Terrific Athenian victory, quite unexpected, but nevertheless not decisive, because the king of Persia, Darius, was going to come back. He unfortunately died in 486, and therefore the campaign of reprisal, which ultimately was to be a campaign of conquest, was led by one of his sons, a man called Xerxes, or Xayathra in Persian, and he invaded in 480. So if you're an Athenian, any time in the middle of the 480s, the big issue, as today for us in Britain, it's Ukraine, the big issue was Persia. When are they going to come back? Can we do anything to resist them? And I think Xanthippus was one of those who said, look, it's not all that possible to do anything. And actually, would it be so awful if the Persians conquered us? There were people like this, and they were called Medizers. They were, as it were, sort of pro-Persians. Typically, they'd say, we want to remain neutral. But some of them would actually say, I'll be prepared to work with the Persians if they do occupy us. So at any rate, for several years, Pericles, little Pericles, aged 11 or so, was in exile with his dad, with his mum, with his family, somewhere we don't know. But that must have coloured his entire career. He would have thought thereafter, that is not something that I want to have to suffer personally, so I don't want to be ostracized, which meant that what you have to do is to get on your side as many Athenians and many ordinary Athenians as possible. Yes, you might be divisive in your policies, but you don't want to be so divisive that a majority of your opponents stack up against you and you get exiled. So I'm leaping ahead. In 480, Xerxes the Persians invade. Massive invasion. There are several major battles, one of which is the Battle of Salamis. Pericles is only 15 or so he's not taking part in the battle. Eventually, the Greeks, led by Athens and Sparta, win. The Persians are repulsed, 479. And in 479, one of the leading commanders of the Greek resistance is Xanthippos. So he's come back from exile. This is Pericles' dad, and been appointed to the highest military office as commander of the united naval force against Persia. He goes right over to what's today Turkey, wins a battle at Mycale, so is rehabilitated. That's the last we hear of Xanthippos. He presumably died soon after that. Pericles comes of age, Athenians come of age at 18. So in about 477, 2 years after the great feats of his dad, and he's on the crest of a wave. And one of the first things he does, interestingly, is sponsor a series of plays by none other than Aeschylus, the famous tragedian. And one of the plays survives. It's called The Persians. Why? Because it's set in one of Persia's capitals, Susa, and it's set at the time of the Battle of Salamis, that is 480, several years before. And the Persian court is in absolute despair. They're weeping and wailing. They've lost this major battle. What are they going to do? And Aeschylus uses it as a way of bringing out the differences between an imperial autocracy with a king who is an absolute ruler, contrasted with what Athens had. And Athens is a pioneer in democracy, that is people power, with ordinary people, that is the citizens, adult males, 18 plus, voting in assembly, voting in law courts to decide their state's policy and to mete out justice as democrats. So Pericles rides the wave of democracy. And in 472, Aeschylus wins the prize, and Pericles is his sponsor in the tragedy competition. Then things get a little bit tough, because Pericles is a great supporter of the man who won the Battle of Salamis, i.e. the general with the greatest input in terms of strategy, tactics, Themistocles, another great Athenian, Themistocles. And the Cles bit at the end of their names means famous. So Pericles is famous all round. Themistocles is famous for Themis, which is justice or right. Themistocles was, if you like, left wing. And he believed that the navy should be the major arm of the Athenian naval equipment. The fighting force of Athens was divided between navy and army, typically. And Themistocles was one of those who thought the navy should predominate. And therefore, the masses, the ordinary Athenians, the poor Athenians who rode the ships. They became the most important element in the armed forces of Athens. We in Britain call the Navy the senior service because it was made first. It was the first organized arm of the armed forces in the 17th century. So for Athens, the Navy was the senior service. Pericles now is casting around for how to promote his career. He's lost Themistocles because Themistocles was ostracized, so he hasn't got a mentor. He turns to another mentor, a man called Ephialtes. And this perhaps is going to come as a bit of a surprise. What is the modern Greek for nightmare? It is Ephialtes. But this is not the Athenian Ephialtes. This is an Ephialtes from northern Greece, from a place called Marlis, who was a traitor. When Xerxes invaded, he attacked the Greeks massed at the pass of Thermopylae. And Ephialtes told Xerxes, there's a way round. You can get them from the rear as well as from the front if you take this pass, the Anapaia Pass. And so Ephialtes has become the modern Greek word for a nightmare, because traitors are nightmare. I mean, they have a perfectly good vocabulary of treachery, prolothea, prolotis, and so on, but Ephialtes, the nightmare man. So that's one way of actually remembering the Athenian politician who wanted to push democracy on a stage further. And he wanted to abolish one vestige of the old pre-democratic regime, the aristocratic, oligarchic regime, which is the Areopagus. He didn't want to abolish the Areopagus Council. He wanted to reform it. He wanted it not to have any political powers. So he did. And Pericles supported him, and this is his first emergence. He's by now about 30, 33, 34 in 462, 461. But though the reforms are passed, Ephialtes is murdered. So first of all, Pericles learns that you've got to watch it. You might be ostracized. Now he learns you might be murdered for your political views. So it takes courage to be the kind of politician he was. And he follows on. Now, the normal way for an aristocrat and a politician to do stuff outside the civil sphere, that is on the battlefield, is to be elected a general. And the Athenians had 10 generals, one representing each tribe. Pericles takes over as the general of his tribe in 454 BC. So he's now in his early 40s, and so he holds the generalship. This is not, in other words, an Alexander the Great who's conquering the world, aged 25 to 30. He's much more measured in the progression of his career. Well, the next major issue in the 450s is the development of democracy, the putting into place and securing the reforms that Ephialtes' package introduced. And that indeed happens. And one of the things he does, Pericles, is propose in the assembly being the body that made the decisions in Athens, he proposed an increase in the pay to jurors. In fact, he introduced the notion that they should be paid at all. Now, in our system, we separate the powers of government, don't we? We distinguish between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, and they shouldn't be the same. They should check each other. The Athenians didn't have that view. If you were a juror, you were chosen by lot to serve on a jury court. It might be a political case, it might be a civil case. They didn't distinguish. They distinguished between public and private, that is personal or political. You would be selected by lot and paid. So that was obviously a very big way of securing support. Because if poor Athenians, they're the majority, think, Pericles is looking after us because he wants us to serve the state. Yes, that's quite right. But he wants us to serve and be rewarded. And so that's very decent. Well, now, what about Persia? Well, Persia's there in the background. They've been defeated in the 480-479 period, but then they're still there and there's still rumblings. Well, Athens has developed a large alliance, and we call it the Athenian Empire. It's a little bit broad, but it has up to 200 members, and the allies are all round the Eastern Mediterranean, basically speaking. It's an island plus mainland alliance to resist the Persians, to prevent them coming back. Well, they're doing okay. And Cyprus is one of those areas which is of contention, and the Athenians and their allies do a great, make a successful victory there. But in Egypt, which you might think, what are they doing getting involved outside the Mediterranean onto land? Well, that's because Egypt was part of the Persian Empire. And local Egyptians appealed to the Athenians, come in, help us throw off the Persian yoke. Athenians went in the 450s, total disaster. So the Athenians have to rethink where they're going to keep the treasury of the alliance. It had previously been on Delos. They moved it to Athens. And then they have to think, should we perhaps consider making peace with Persia? In other words, it's quite expensive, all this fighting and raising money and tribute and so on. And they do, or at least some of us think they do. And I have to be honest here that the evidence for quite a lot of the 5th century history, even the 5th, is not brilliant. So there are those who don't think there was a formal peace. There are those who think there was, as it were, a cessation of hostilities, which comes to the same thing. Anyway, what this does is free up the Athenians to spend what money they've accumulated in their treasury, some from the allies, but mainly from internal sources, remembering they possessed these amazing silver mines within their own territory, fundamental precious metal. They then decide to start on a rampage, if you like, of building, rebuilding. They had quite extraordinary left the temples and so on, which had been destroyed by the Persians. They'd left them as ruins ever since 480, 479. So for 30 years, if you were to go to Athens, you'd look up on the Acropolis and, well, you wouldn't actually see any temples rising above at all because they'd all been flattened. So from the early 440s, and this is where Pericles comes in a big way, though exactly what his role was. There's a terrific building program. I mentioned just the one most famous building, the Parthenon. And that building program occupies the 440s, 430s. Meanwhile, now that the Persian issue has been solved, there arises the Spartan issue. Now, in 480-479, very temporarily, Athens and Sparta agreed to fight with each other, together with each other, against an external enemy, the Persians. But there's always been a feeling in Sparta that why should we allow the Athenians? They're relatively Johnny-come-latelys, fly-by-nights. We mustn't let them get too big for their boots. In Athens, there's the other view. Hey, look, it was really us, Salamis, That was the key victory in the Persian Wars, the Greco-Persian Wars. So we really deserve to take the credit as leaders of the Greeks. So you get a competition, a kind of struggle for prestige. But because both Sparta was the head of its own alliance and Athens was the head of its alliance, the two alliances start to clash. There are areas of conflict where an ally of one is in also cahoots with, or would like to be in cahoots with the other, so that there are points of pressure. Anyway, everything comes to a head. I'm simplifying here, the end of the 430s, the huge conflict breaks out. And we call it the Peloponnesian War, or the Atheno-Peloponnesian War. Pericles has, by this time, late 430s, become the dominant force, the most authoritative single Athenian politician. So what he thinks is important. Now, how do we know what he thought about anything? We've got no diaries. That's true of pretty much everything in the ancient world, of course. So we have historians and we have playwrights. The historians include Thucydides, one of the most famous historians ever, who happens to be an Athenian. He's much younger than Pericles, born in about 460, so he's about 35 years younger. But he's of an age, when the Peloponnesian War comes to break out, he's in his mid-30s, and therefore in a position to understand. And during the war, he's elected himself a general, but he fails. And he's therefore in a position to write a history of this great war. But he's bound to be slightly prejudiced, is he not? And since he's not a democrat in an ideological sense, you'd imagine that he'd have a go at any democratic leader. Well, he does have a go at most of them. He says they were incompetent, self-serving, and that's why the war didn't go brilliantly to begin with. One man he singles out for praise is Pericles. And it's thanks to Thucydides, combined with a much, much later biography by Plutarch, another Greek, but he wrote about 100 AD, not 300 or 400 BC, hundreds of years later. So thanks to Thucydides and Pericles, I am able to write a biography. Cut a long story short, war breaks out. Doesn't go well for either side to begin with, but it goes worse for Athens because Athens suffers a great plague. We're not sure exactly what, probably typhoid. And guess what? Pericles catches it and dies from it. So from the point of view of my biography, my history of Athens, Greece, in the 5th century BC effectively ends in 429 BC, which is when Pericles died of complications of the plague. Now, what I've not mentioned yet is his private life. And insofar as a politician can have one, his was quite extraordinary. He starts out conventionally. He marries an aristocratic woman somehow related to him. This is classic aristocratic stuff. But we don't know her name. It's quite extraordinary by modern standards, but in ancient times, women were supposed to be not even heard, let alone seen. And so they were kept in the background. Very typically, one knows very little about individual women. We know the name of his two sons with that woman. They're Xanthippos, that's conventional. You name your first son after his paternal grandfather. And then his second son, much more interesting name, Paralos. Now, Paralos is a hero. He's a dim and distant ancient Athenian, and he's not a Theseus, he's not a really famous one, but he is a local boy. And what I think Pericles is doing by giving his son that name is saying, look, my son is one of you, one of us. And the name of one of the two state warships, the Athenians had two state warships, and one was called after Salamis, Salaminia, but the other one was called Paralos. And I think Pericles was linking his son's name with the navy, and he needed the support of the naval citizens. At any rate, that lady was divorced by Pericles. And later, it seems that there's not a direct connection. He falls for, head, line, and sinker, head over heels, for a woman called Aspasia, or we normally say Aspasia. Now, she came from Miletus, which is in today's Western Turkey. And there's a huge irony here. because of the law he passed. Remember that law? You have to have an Athenian mother to be legitimate after 451. So he gets together with Aspasia after 451. He has a son with her, but that son cannot be an Athenian citizen. He is illegitimate. They called him, again, I think this is very significant, rather boringly, Pericles. And the point here, I think, is because he's illegitimate, he can't join the regular. As you get older in Athens, you join various civic groups, a phratry, for example, and you celebrate festivals together, all that sort of thing. Well, Pericles Jr. couldn't do that. So in case there was any doubt who his dad was, you call him Pericles. So when Pericles died, his two legitimate sons also died of the plague. So there's Pericles leaving Aspasia without a partner, but with a son who is not an Athenian. Well, a special measure was passed, recommended by somebody to the assembly, that Pericles should be made a citizen, given the... And he was. And I'll end on this. He was made a citizen and he was elected a general. Sadly, he was elected a general in a battle which, though it was a victory, turned out as a defeat because, complicated situation, lots of Athenians died. They weren't rescued. It's a naval battle just off Lesbos, up in the northeast Aegean. And though it was won by the Athenians, many thousands of Athenian sailors died. And so the generals, of which Pericles Jr. was one, they were prosecuted for dereliction of duty, a form of treason, all convicted of and therefore condemned to death. So that was the end of Pericles Jr. Rather sad way for Pericles' bloodline to die.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We're foodies at heart at Ouzo Talk, which is why we love the Greek providor. Get a real taste of the very best produce that Greece has to offer. From olive oils and delicious artisan sweets, to earthy herbs, memorable wines, warming spirits and more. All made by passionate, independent farmers and producers from across Greece. So whether you're looking to fill your pantry or buy a special gift for a loved one, the Greek Providor has you covered. Visit thegreekprovidor.com.au today and bring Greece home.
Just a quick side note, what was the population of Athens around that time?
Right, so we've got three different types or different statuses, if you like. The citizen population, the Athenians, they called themselves, fluctuated between 30 and 60,000 adult males, 18 plus. Multiply that by 4, and you get the figure for the total citizen population at any one time. So between 120,000 and maybe as many as 240,000 citizens. Add to them resident, non-citizen, free people. If you live in Athens for more than a month, you have to register, if you're a foreigner and you're free, as a metoikos, somebody who changes their oikos, their residence. Meta meaning change. So you become a metic, we call them. You need a patron, a citizen, and you have to pay a tax. So it's not an honorific status, but it's a regular status by law. You have obligations as a metic. You might have to fight in the army if you're an adult male. We estimate something of the order of 10, 20,000 of them, men and women. And of course they fluctuate, they come and go. And they're concentrated in the Piraeus, because many of them are working in the port area, dockers and that sort of thing. Sure. And then the third main group, which by our standards is of course atrocious, but was taken for granted pretty much then, is unfree people. slaves, both men and women, household and factory workers. And the guesstimate is of the order of 80 to 100,000 of them. And they're not allowed to reproduce. So they're not allowed to have families. They're not, they probably did have sex with their masters or mistresses, but not technically with each other. And they couldn't have legitimate offspring. So they have to be bought on the market, and they're constantly replenished. They live, they may be freed, or they just die, or they disappear somehow, or they run away. But that slave population is not a constant population in the way that the citizen population is. So estimates differ up to 300, 400,000 for the whole territory of Athens and its surrounding Gi. It's Hora. It's Gi Attiki in Greek.
I think I was just trying to get at more how many citizens could vote, because it sounded like there was a lot of death, and then I was going to touch on the plague as well. But before we get there,
well, I'll tell you how many could vote. Means any of those adult males over the age of 18 were entitled to attend the assembly and vote. They couldn't speak until they were over 20, and they couldn't hold various offices of state until they were 30. But from the age of 18, maturity, legal maturity kicked in. How many of them actually spoke is a quite different issue at an assembly. How many actually held offices is another issue. So very few people ever spoke. I mean, imagine on a hillside, underneath the Acropolis on the Pnyx Hill, in a crowd of 6,000 or so, no microphones. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary to think that the whole thing could happen at all, let alone successfully. And then, so far as the holding of offices is concerned, there is one which pretty much every Athenian might aspire to once, because it was chosen by lot, not by election. And this is to be a member of the council for 1 year. So there was a council of 500, and any measure that was debated and voted in the assembly had first of all to go to the council. Now the council could say, sure, that's a great idea, we're going to just put it on the agenda and have people discuss it either side and then vote. Or they could say, well, we don't quite like the terms in which this proposal is being put, so we suggest the following amendments. And then they would be voted on in the council, 500 of them, and if they were passed, majority vote, then it would be an amended issue, proposal that would go to the assembly, which could then amend it again. And then there's the third way, which is that the council could simply say, no, we refuse to put that on the assembly's agenda. So being a member of the council was a really big deal. Plus, the council was the administration of the Athenian state. So for example, keeping the streets clean of ordure, this was a matter for the council. At one very basic level, at the other level, right up the top, the council checked the accounts of any office holder who dealt with public money. You had to pass an audit. And if you didn't pass it, if the committee decided you were guilty of peculation, for example, then you would be prosecuted in a people's jury court where some of the juries were as many as 501. They were really, really big. There were 6,000 Athenians every year empaneled, so they could be called. And then if they wanted to sit on a particular jury, they would put everybody had an identity token, a little bronze strip with their official name on, and they pitched up, put it in a machine. The machine spat it out or didn't. It said, yes, you've been chosen for this court or not. And then you got a baton, you got a stick, because you had to get your money. So you had to prove that you'd actually pitched up in court court. You didn't just get your money because you've been chosen to sit in a court. When you got to the court, you had to exchange your stick for the money, which you got after the case was heard. Every case, by the way, heard in the same day. So it wasn't a matter of having to go back day after day.
Growing up, when we heard the name Pericles, we always had a connection to the Parthenon. Can you give us a little bit of a background on how he commissioned the Parthenon? Was it more of a civic or a political building?
I'll take those in order. First of all, it's not absolutely certain that he was the mastermind of the whole thing. So we know the names of the two architects. We know the name of the famous craftsman who did the cult statue. That's Phidias. We know Pericles was a friend of Phidias and that he was associated specifically because he got prosecuted in association with Phidias for stealing money from that had been allocated. It's all actually probably untrue, but certainly, in other words, Pericles was associated with the Parthenon in some way. However, in order to build it, and as you know, it's an exceptionally complex building in terms of its mathematical refinements and the extent of its architectural sculpture. It's unique in the entire Greek world. And it's not the biggest temple of all, but it's the most elaborate and the most sophisticated. And of course, today, the most famous. So now, in order for any building to be built, it has to be subjected to a number of scrutinies. So I mentioned that any bill, any measure on the assembly's agenda had to go through the council. So someone or somebody, a group, put to the council the proposition, let's build a Parthenon. That then goes to the council. The council obviously say, that's great. Okay, how much is it going to cost? And who do you want to be the architect? All those consequential details meant that a committee of the council was established, which was partly to look after the finances, partly to look after the actual mechanics, which contractors are going to do which bit of the Parthenon, at what time, in what order, to what degree of finery, etc., etc. So immensely complicated. But what that means is, and I insist on this, that the Parthenon was as democratic a building as it's possible to imagine, because so much scrutiny went into not only the decision to build it, but to build it as it was eventually built. And it was done incredibly quickly. The main structure was in place within 9 years. So starts off in 447. By 438, the fundamentals of the building are done. The cult statue comes later, and the final refinements are completed by 432. So the whole thing is 15 years, start to finish. Financing partly from external funds, for example, tribute that's in the treasury, which is now on the Acropolis of Athens, and it's legitimately there. At least this is what the advocates of the scheme would say, because what is this for? What is the Parthenon symbolizing? Well, it's symbolizing Athens as leader of the Greeks, and very specifically leaders of Greek freedom from the threat of Persian control. And Persian occupation and control would have resulted in transformation, especially at Athens, of the political system. You would not have had, they would not have allowed the kind of democracy that Athens had to persist. Now, exactly what the different bits of the Parthenon sculpture mean, in some cases it's fairly clear because they're mythical, and the fundamental dividing line is between them and us, and we are civilized and we are law-abiding, and they and their barbarians of various sorts. Non-Greeks, Amazons, of course, are non-men, so they're opposite to Greeks in Greek men in two ways. These are uncivilized. They're a threat to civilization. We, Athens, stand for all Greeks, and all Greeks stand for a decent, civilized life according to the rule of law, not arbitrary control by one man who is non-responsible, irresponsible, not subject to audit. The Athenians were very hot on auditing, on holding to account anybody who acted in the name of the Athenians, whether in the assembly or in the law courts. And then that really is, in a way, all there is to it. Of course, it's massively controversial. Not every Athenian thought it was the best way to spend public money. They thought it was, or they argued, let's put it this way, or you could say they used as a weapon against Pericles, because there were a lot of people who were jealous of Pericles, or they were maybe more conservative than Pericles. They wanted to bring him down. Anyway, they said that this is a misuse of public funds. And so to that extent, Pericles would be held accountable for the entire project because he was, without question, one of its leading advocates. But whether it would have happened in the way it did without him it's, I think, possible. It's not the case, in other words, that it wouldn't have happened at all, or that it wouldn't have happened magnificently without Pericles.
In terms of the legacy of the Parthenon and the role, let's say, that Pericles may have played in it, there's two quotes that I think sort of go hand in hand in terms of that speak to each other. One from Pericles himself and one from your colleague Nigel Spivey. The first being that all kinds of enterprises should be created which will provide an inspiration for every art, find employment for every hand. We must devote ourselves to acquiring things that will be the source of everlasting fame. I read that and I just wonder to myself, in history, have there been many examples of that kind of approach to a building, to a civic building campaign, to unite a city and to give?
Yeah, the way I see it, I mean, to find a modern equivalent is quite difficult, but in my country, the nearest, and it's not very near, is St. Paul's Cathedral, as opposed to Westminster Abbey. Now, Westminster Abbey is where our kings and queens are crowned, and it's, if you like, wholly sacred. St. Paul's, of course, named after me. No, I mean, I'm named after I'm named after him. But it is, of course, a religious space, but it is the cathedral of the British Empire. On the other hand, look back to its construction in its modern form. That it's not the first St. Paul's. The one that was there first was burnt down in the Great Fire of 1666. But the present St. Paul's is associated with one man who's not a monarch, not a leading politician, but an architect and a mathematician of genius. That is Sir Christopher Wren. And so, whereas the Parthenon is Athens, and therefore Pericles, being the most authoritative Athenian spokesman of his day, whatever he said about it would be the general view of what that building was and stood for. Christopher Wren is arguing a quite different case, that he wants to make the most magnificent building that the state will permit him to make, and to get a certain amount of credit, but not to make a political statement in and of itself. It's secondary that it becomes the cathedral of the empire, because Britain didn't have much of an empire in the 17th century. It gets going in the 18th century. But Athens did have an empire in the 440s, relatively trivial empire in the 440s, and today that is an aspect that people get exercised about. And that quotation you make, some people throw that back and say that's vainglory, that's almost hubristic, and therefore when the Peloponnesian War breaks out, I mentioned Pericles dies, they lose the war. After a very long time, it takes nearly 30 years. That is Athens' nemesis for its hubristic behavior in the 440s and 430s. Well, that's a very modern point of view.
The other quote is from your colleague Nigel Spivey, who said, democracy itself becomes heroized in that monument. It's a very democratic thing that wants to include all those citizens who participated in beating off the first great threat to democracy from the Persians. These are ideals to which you can aspire.
I entirely agree with my colleague, and he's referring there not to the mythical creatures and humans, but they're mythical on the outside of the temple. But there is this famous frieze, 160 meters, not a unique feature of a Greek temple, but unique in length and richness of sculptural decoration.
Yes.
And so what does it represent? Now, this is a really ticklish thing because with almost no exceptions, there are one or two, humans, that is obviously human beings, real life human beings, whether present or past, are not depicted on temples. Just simply that is a rule of thumb. So why are so many people that look like real human beings depicted on the Parthenon frieze? Well, one way around this is, I've been tempted by this, I change my mind from time to time, is that they are heroized. So yes, they're humans, they're Athenians, they did once live, but after their deaths, they were raised above to the level between humans and gods, which is demigods, which is heroes. And there is one group of Athenians who that did happen to collectively, and it's the marathon guys. They even have a name, Marathonomachai, the marathon battlers or marathon fighters, the 192, not 193, not 191, but 192. This is from Herodotus, who were killed on the Battle of Marathon 490 BC. At the earlier stage of the resistance to Persia, successful battle. And there's a theme running through a lot of Athenian, both public pronouncements, prayers, and architecture and pottery, celebrating the fact that the Marathon battle was the first, not the last, but the first of the great victories for freedom from Persia, won then almost entirely by the Athenians. Of course, they could bang on about that. They were actually helped by the men of Plataea, but they tended to keep quiet about that and say, it was just us. We did it. We won the Battle of Marathon. So that's, to me, quite plausible that what you're looking at in the Parthenon frieze, half of which is now in the British Museum, half of which is now in Athens still, is a celebration of Athens, and specifically Marathon, all worshipping the gods, all the gods, but especially, of course, Athena, who was the patron god of the city of Athens. And there is one festival, every 4 years, it's called the Great Panathenaea, and that's the nearest we can come. It's not a precise match for the elements that you see in the frieze. There are bits in the Parthenon which are not in the Panathenaea, and there are bits in the Panathenaea we know about that are not in the Parthenon frieze, but it is strongly Panathenaic.
Sorry, you just touched on the 192 deaths.
Yes.
Were they buried in a mound near Marathon?
Yes,
Is that
the Soros.
Did I read that correctly?
They were. What you see today has been heavily reworked. It's been excavated and put back together and so on. So you're not looking at what it looked like in 489, the year after but they did indeed heap up a huge mound. The bodies were cremated and the ashes were put inside the Soros, which was a landmark in antiquity, and was, of course, very interesting to the first travellers in early modern period, 17th, 18th century, and then when excavation started, Greek excavation, by the new Greek state after the 1830s, Marathon was obviously a place where Greeks were going to say, that's ours, we're going to excavate that.
Yeah, brilliant.
I want to talk about some of the people that Pericles is known to have held court with. I mean, this is a generation of people who I mean, I don't know how you can compare it. I mean, these are some of the most influential people in the history of Western civilization. I mean, Pericles would sit down in symposium with guys like Anaxagoras, Herodotus, Aeschylus, Euripides. I mean, was well, yeah. And I mean, was this something that he consciously did as a way to learn? Is that part of his ethos and the way that he conducted his business, or was it just pure interest for him?
I think it's a combination. And remember, I mentioned that his first public act was to sponsor Aeschylus in 472. So yes, there was a political dimension to that. Yes, there was a theatrical, choregic dimension. But what he liked, I think, was to combine what we would call arts and science and literature and politics. He's very, very unusual. And he was helped, of course, enormously by his partner in life, the one that he lived with from about 450 to his death in 429, so for about 20-odd years, Aspasia of Miletus. The evidence for her is not, of course, brilliant, and some of it is scurrilous. I mean, quite obviously false and just making fun of her because she's a woman. But the serious evidence suggests she was an intellectual, a blue stocking with her own salon, that she invited people in, with Pericles there, of course, but to engage in conversation. And so that she was, unlike most women, confined to the women's quarters. She would actually mingle and mix with men in the men's quarters in Pericles' house. Very, very unusual. You mentioned Anaxagoras, and I'm going to mention one other, Hippodamos. You mentioned others, and there are a ton. This is one of those generations, or two generations, a bit like Florence around about 1500, yes, or Paris in the late 18th century. Totally exceptional, but quite extraordinary, and in this case, intellectually remarkable. So Anaxagoras, he came from the Asiatic part of the Greek world, like Aspasia, and he was particularly interested in mathematics and astronomy. And he was also what we would call a rationalist. And of course, most scientists today would take it for granted, but in the 5th century BC, most Athenians, most Greeks, thought the sun was a god. And no, for Anaxagoras, it was a red-hot stone, rather larger than the Peloponnese. Now, how he worked out the dimensions of the sun, I don't know. I'm not privy to his way of thinking. But the point of reducing the sun from a god to a very hot stone is a quite remarkable intellectual leap. And I think it's something that Pericles would have found congenial, because as far as we can tell, he was not at all superstitious. Many Greeks were superstitious, nor was he particularly religious. So he didn't make a fetish of religious observance. And I think, by and large, his attitude to life was secular. And in that respect, he was pretty like Thucydides, the historian. And that may be one reason why Thucydides approved of Pericles, apart from the fact that Thucydides thought Pericles had better judgment than most of his fellow politicians. And then the other one, Hippodamos. Now, like Aspasia, he came from Miletus, and he's associated with a particular kind of town planning, which is rational, which is grid plan, so checkerboard, and it's called Hippodamian. Actually, he didn't invent it, but he so introduced it to the Piraeus that he made of the Piraeus a second city. So the old Athens, which is inland, about 5 miles or so inland from Piraeus, that's higgledy-piggledy, and it just grew organically all over the place, no planning. Piraeus ditto until about 450, 440. Athens is now the biggest harbour in the Eastern Mediterranean, has the biggest fleet, it's the biggest naval thing. Hippodamus is hired to reduce Piraeus to order. And I think that suits Pericles. Pericles had an orderly kind of mind. He'd have been appreciative of that. Plus, now this is something quite surprising, Hippodamus is the earliest person we know to have written a political utopia, in other words, a blueprint for a really good version of the polis, the best kind of city you can imagine. Well, Plato followed on, Aristotle, it's a genre, but Hippodamus was, as it happens, the first to do that. We don't know much about it, but we do know that that's the sort of guy that Pericles is associating with. And that's brought to mind just one more, if I've got time for that. You've probably heard of Protagoras. Protagoras came from Abdera, which is right up in the north. And most intellectuals gravitated to Athens as the kind of intellectual capital of the Greek world. And he had a very interesting view about the gods. He said he couldn't commit himself to saying that they definitely did exist. So he was the original agnostic. He didn't say they didn't exist, but he said he couldn't be sure that they did. In other words, he lacked empirical proof. And he gave two reasons. He said, life is short. And the problem, the subject of theology is difficult. I think that's a bit of a cop-out. But the other thing he said was that man, that is human beings, are the measure of all things. It's according to what we consider to be the case that the case is. So if we think democracy is a good thing, it is a good thing. And he was himself a Democrat, as was, of course, Pericles and Hippodamus and most of Pericles' associates. There's one guy who possibly was not as democratic as some of the others, a man called Damon, but that's another issue. He was an Athenian. He was ostracized.
I mean, just imagine being able to sit down with the types
blokes.
of people that we're talking about here. And I mean, you mentioned Abdera there. I'm not sure if the person you mentioned there, Paul, is the same as Protagoras. The second that you said Abdera, the series, I don't know if you've seen it, Paul. You must have the original Cosmos series that Carl Sagan hosted.
I've read about it.
He mentions Democritus of Abdera, who was famous for it.
I've actually written a little book. It's only 50 pages long, but on Democritus.
Oh, really?
He's a great hero of mine. And the main nuclear research lab in Athens, atomic physics, is called the Democritos Lab.
Yes.
And he was an amazing man. He lived nearly 100 years. He was born in the 5th century and died in the 4th century.
Well, he took pride of place in Cosmos.
Well, quite right. I mean, he's an atomist, and atom means not cuttable, atomos. And so he said everything in the world, everything is made of either atoms or the void. And what an atom was, he was a little pressed to explain, because they lacked electron microscopes to discover electrons, protons, and neutrons. But he formulated an atomistic theory, which ultimately is a humanistic, non-theological type of explanation of the way the world is. Not human life, not cultural life, but the physical world. Matter.
See, and that all came out of Abdera, a nondescript place.
And yet, there's an irony here. I don't know if there's the equivalent in Australia, but in Ireland, if you come from Kerry, they laugh at you. You know, Kerry men are figures of fun. Well, Abderites in Greece were just thought of as stupid. Generically.
This is what Carl Sagan was talking about. He mentioned the fact that, he went to great lengths to talk about how people thought that people from Abdera were stupid.
Yes.
And to have someone like this come out of nowhere with such a forward-thinking theory, unbelievable. There we go. We spoke about Abdera today.
Fantastic.
Yes,
digressed.
yes.
Wow.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's good.
That's
it's good.
Great.
Good stuff. Well, I've got a sort of offbeat question. If Pericles was around today in modern-day Athens as a politician, How would he go today? Would he thrive in today's community, or would he find it challenging?
I'm going to say something slightly controversial to begin with. One of the qualities of Pericles, which was singled out by Thucydides, was he was impervious to bribes. And yes, he was incorruptible. And Thucydides uses a superlative form of a negative adjective, adhorotatos. So alpha, privative, thoron in ancient Greek meant both a gift and a bribe. So he is the most ungifted, adhorotatos. And I think, and this is inevitable really, that most politicians are more or less corrupt today, most. And so he might infuse a certain degree of rectitude into the political system. But one thing that he brilliantly avoided, he didn't have to face general elections. What I've not said yet, there were no parties. So he was entirely dependent on himself and a small circle of mates to keep him where he was, abreast of affairs, proposing when appropriate or supporting when appropriate, but generally pushing things along in directions that he believed in or opposing directions that he thought were counterproductive. So he, because of his authority, was associated with pretty much every policy shift in Athens between about 450 and 430. You could even push it back a bit earlier than 450. But for very few politicians today are their careers 20 years at the very summit. Eventually, he did come crashing down. I mentioned the war broke out and the plague got him. But before he died, he was actually deselected from an office that he was holding because the majority was so unhappy with the way the war was going and the plague that they were suffering. And they looked for a scapegoat and they fastened on Pericles. He was deselected and fined. But when the elections came round next time, the usual one, he was re-elected. So he was elected general 15 times, more than anybody else.
So he wouldn't last.
I don't think he would.
Give him 6 months.
Quite.
I don't want to use the word naive, or idealistic or anything like that. But are we talking about someone who is that incorruptible? Is he the model for the politician that everyone should be aspiring to?
It's a difficult one, that, because I think what lies behind your question is that politics actually is messy. It's a matter of compromise. And Pericles was, I think, as you said, Nick, in a way too good for modern politics, but in a way he was too good even for his own day's politics, because he was somewhat rigid. And he was very clever at sussing out the way the wind was likely to blow, both in domestic and foreign relations. He was good at sensing, they didn't have opinion polls, but he had a good way through the theatre of finding out just how unpopular or what about him might be considered to be unpopular. It's a very interesting source on him, actually, not to be trusted. But, for example, he's laughed at because of the shape of his head, which resembles an onion. And so that's why he had to wear a helmet. Well, it wasn't. He didn't wear a helmet. He only had himself depicted in a helmet, and he only wore a helmet when he was a general. He didn't go around wearing a helmet. And even in the assembly, he didn't wear a helmet. But people think of him as sort of so comic poets said, he's wearing it to hide the shape of his head, which is, of course, a good sort of satirical joke. But, yeah. Brilliant. So I think too rigid and had no party base, so therefore he has to be more flexible. But in today's world, which party would he join? That's the other question. We might be shocked and find out that he'd be a supporter of someone we possibly weren't terribly keen on, but who knows?
Absolutely. Well, in terms of that as well, I mean, so much of what we've spoken about, particularly with Aspasia, it seems very forward-thinking and very, a very modern way to look at things when it comes to the treatment of women and whatnot. for him to be allowing at that point in history for a woman to have a seat at the table, I mean, is it fair to say that he was forward thinking in that respect? Is that something that he felt needed to be adopted across the board, or was it specifically for Aspasia?
Well, on the one hand, you'd say yes, and the fact that he chose to live with a woman that he could not legally marry in the sense of normal Athenian wedding ritual, and therefore have a legitimate child with, that was hugely eccentric. And if you like, aristocrats very often are eccentric, and so in that sense, one might have predicted it. I don't think, though, if you're normal type of politician, this is really an incubus. It's not a help to you at all. So therefore, he must have had some principled reason for sticking with her, as well as being, of course, as I say, head over heels, at least to begin with. And there were various scandalous stories. You know what? When he left the house in the morning, he kissed her. And when he came back home, he kissed her. So, of course, allegedly, at the doorstep. I don't think so.
Right.
I think these things are made up. But the point is that his relationship was eccentric to a degree. However, before we get carried away into thinking he was a proto-feminist, in the famous funeral speech which he delivered, but the one that we have, Thucydides' version, is not the one he spoke. Towards the end, he almost reluctantly turns aside to women. In other words, he's spoken mainly to the men in his audience, but in front of him are widows and sisters of dead men and so on. The men are all, the dead are all male, but the audience is female as well as male. So he says, if I must spare a word for the widows among you, my advice is this: do not be inferior to your nature. In other words, women's nature is less admirable than men's. Women are, for example, more emotional, less able to control their grief. And he's telling them to man up, as it were, to be brave, put on a brave face, not to weep and wail and gnash teeth and bash breasts and so on, which was the normal way of women mourning their kinfolk. So that doesn't come across well at all. It sounds horribly superstitious, and also, frankly, sexist.
Unsurprising, let's say, from that period in history.
Disappointing, I think. Yeah.
I've got a question from a history teacher at Waverley College. His name's Dr. Panayotis Diamandis. His students have got some questions as well, but they're not related to Pericles, but we'll ask them later on.
Okay.
So his question is, to what extent may Pericles be considered the successor of Themistocles as the Athenian leader?
Right. Well, I did deliberately mention Themistocles as a mentor. Now, Themistocles was an aristocrat, but not from the absolute top drawer. Pericles, actually, his ancestry on his mother's side was superior. He was the grand-nephew of Cleisthenes, the founder of the Athenian democracy. And his mother was of the Alcmeonid family, so descendants of an original ancestor, Alcmeon. Very, very famous, very, very well established. And so Themistocles was relatively a newcomer and therefore perhaps less constrained. And it does seem that he was the first to see that Athens, because of its geography, was likely to prove as great, at any rate, as great a power on the sea as on the land. So not to concentrate solely on the land. When he became archon, this is chief elected official of the Athenian state, giving his name to the year, so it was in the year of Themistocles, he started the fortification of Piraeus. Piraeus has 3 harbours, and he started the fortification of the military harbour harbour. And then, as I say, he was the brains behind the victory at Salamis, by which time Pericles is 15 and therefore in a position to have a sense of what's going on, and probably to discover that his father didn't like didn't like Themistocles very much at all. And so Pericles, in veering towards Themistocles, is already distancing himself from his family, from his father at any rate. And then, well, Themistocles gets ostracized about 470. That's about 10 years after Salamis. And the reasoning seems to be that Themistocles then thought the main enemy of Athens was no longer Persia, but Sparta. And this is in a way very foresighted, and Thucydides, who writes about Themistocles, praises him especially for his foresight. So that Pericles had in common with Themistocles, foresight, pro-navy, pro-democracy. And I think, yes, the answer to the student's question is, or the teacher's question, yes, he was a very major mentor of Pericles at a crucial period, that is, when he's coming of age in his late teens and early 20s.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. Just to sort of wrap up Pericles, because we're running out of time. I mean, obviously you've written this book, which will be out next year, and we're obviously going to give our listeners as much information as possible for where to find that book. Thanks. And whatnot. Is it an oversimplification to say that his downfall with the plague that you mentioned earlier was the beginning of the end for the classic period of Athens, or does it go deeper than that? I'll
answer that, but I'll go back a bit, because remember we talked about revisionism, and one of the elements of that is the phrase the age of Pericles, or Periclean Athens, or Periclean democracy. Is that a legitimate use of the adjective or the noun Pericles? And part of my book is to suggest it's okay, but only up to a point. Then now, as to the question, was his death the beginning of the end of classicism? Very much not. His policies for the winning of the Peloponnesian War would not have worked. And they didn't work for reasons other than his lack of foresight for once. But nevertheless, Athens was probably going to lose the Peloponnesian War anyway, regardless of what Pericles' successors did, though they did make things worse. However, was the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War the end of, as it were, Athens as cultural capital of ancient Greece? By no means. So Pericles and his mates fade away. Thucydides is the last of that generation. He dies round about 400 BC. But then we're going to get into Plato, Xenophon, Demosthenes, and all sorts of mathematicians, Euclid and Eudoxus in the 4th century BC. And Athens is every bit as much what Plato called the city hall of wisdom, which means intelligence and excellence, in the 4th century BC, the 300s, as it had been in the 400s. It's just that the world around has changed. Persia's less important, and the Greeks are more important. Then Alexander the Great is the real end of classicism, but it's, if you like, a new classicism, an expanded classicism, because the foundation of Alexandria, the library and the museum, guarantees that on the one hand it looks back, it gathers all the wisdom accumulated over the past centuries and enshrines it in papyrus in the museum and library. At the same time, it's conducting absolutely cutting-edge scientific mathematical research, astronomy and literary criticism, so that it looks forward to the era of domination culturally, even over the Romans. The Romans conquered the Greeks, but materially, politically, militarily, but the Greeks conquered the Romans intellectually, culturally, spiritually. So Pericles is a moment, but he's by no means the end of a chapter.
So how important is this period that we're talking about, or how much does Western civilization owe to this moment in history?
It owes as much to it as to any other, and more than most, but not exclusively. So I've actually spent a lot of my career trying to argue that it's an accident that the 5th century in our language is where it is, so 500 to 400, because that's just an accident of the birth of Christ and what the Byzantines did, dividing up AD and BC and so on, So it looks as if 400 is a sharp thing, but of course it didn't mean that to them at all. They weren't living in the 5th century BC or anything else. But I believe that we talked earlier about the equivalent of Florence in about 1500, just simply the number of amazing thinkers, artists, craftsmen in that period, round about 450 to 420, I would put it like that. Quite extraordinary, but not unique. So when people say the golden age of ancient Greece, often they do mean the 5th century. I would say, hang on, the 300s was pretty much a golden age in various respects. Then you add those two together. So add Herodotus, Thucydides to Plato, Aristotle, Demosthenes, among others, and you get classicism that is inherited by Alexandria and built on by the library, and then the Romans come in and take over the whole bang shoot.
Fantastic summary.
That is brilliant. Look, I've learnt so much about Athens in general as well as Pericles. But look, we could go on forever, Tom. But I think we've got to wrap it up.
Well, the message is you need to buy the book.
Yeah.
So when the book comes out, obviously we're going to share all that information, and we can't wait to read it.
It's just a teaser.
It is in many respects.
But
look, we do have questions, as we alluded to earlier. One of the great things about this podcast is that people are getting in contact with us and asking questions. So we thought, look, we may as well just go straight to the source, to the font of knowledge, give people the opportunity, students and teachers the opportunity to ask Paul some questions. And Nick, I think we should probably start, given you've read Panagioti's question earlier. Panagiotis has actually been on the show previously, Paul. He's very, very, very involved. And what's his role again, Nick? With the Greek genocide?
Yeah, genocide. He's done the Khmer Rouge and other types of genocides. He's got a doctorate in studying of genocides. Right. But he's actually a high school teacher, not too far from here, actually. It's called Waverley College.
Yeah.
And one of his students, a boy called Harry, is studying ancient history. And his question is, so there's 3 questions. The first one is, what were the main reasons for the Persian Wars? How did the Persian War impact the Greek world, especially the relationship between Athens and Sparta?
So Persia rose as an imperial power in the middle of the 6th century. So that's the 550s, under the leadership of a man who was half Persian, half Mede. They're both Iranian peoples, called Cyrus, Kurash in his native tongue. And that meant that as he expanded west, he hit the pale of Greek settlement along the west coast of what's today Turkey. So immediately there's a question. Do you resist? Do you go in, and on what terms, if you're allowed any terms whatsoever? Now, Cyrus famously was a relatively tolerant ruler, and therefore Greeks weren't required to convert to Ahura Mazdaism, Zoroastrianism, the Persians' dominant religion. They were subjects, they had to pay tribute. And this was the case until about 500 BC, so for about 45 years, those Greek cities along the western seaboard of Turkey remained passively in the Persian Empire. And then they revolted. And they revolted, I think, partly encouraged by, in Athens. Athens has this political transformation to democracy. And so they go into revolt with Athenian help. It's a total disaster. And the one outcome, very negative, the Persians now know about the Athenians, and they want to stop, for the future, any interference in their sphere, which is Asia, from the Greeks of the mainland, especially Athens. So they send their first expedition to punish Athens. They, on the way, punish Eretria, which is a city on the island of Euboea. So the first expedition, the Persian Wars, begin circa 500, 490, and they culminate in 490 with the Battle of Marathon, a quite extraordinary, unpredictable victory by the Athenians with their Plataean allies. So that's why the Athenians are an irritation, and no more than that. But after 490, Darius, then the king of the great emperor of Persia, Darius I, dies, and his son Xerxes is cut from a different cloth. He's a more hot-headed man. He's more angry. He's more greedy. And so he wants not just to punish the Athenians again, but he wants to occupy them and to control them and to incorporate not only them, but anybody who supports them in resisting him in mainland Greece, in the Persian Empire. And so what was at stake for not just Athens, but mainland Greece was freedom from Persia or not. Doesn't affect directly the kind of political systems they had in Greece, but typically now, once Athens leads the resistance, there becomes an association between democracy and resistance to Persia, and Persia is cast as a tyranny, as a non-democratic, anti-democratic autocracy, not the sort of political regime we Greeks, we free Greeks, want. So that, I think, copes with the first question. As to the second, the impact, well, as I've said, thereafter, the question from 490 on in Athens was the Persian question. After 480, 479, in the eastern Mediterranean, that is Athens and its allies, again, the Persian question dominates for the next 40-odd years until some sort of cessation of hostilities. And there are cases of cities that were in the Persian Empire, which Athens had liberated, but then there's a group in that city who want to go back into the Persian Empire because they think the Persians will support them because they're not democrats against the Athenians. So the relations between Greeks within the Aegean Greek world is complicated immensely by the Persian question. And that remains the case until Alexander the Great. And there was a third question, Nick. What was that one?
Look, sorry, it was actually the two questions.
Right.
I think the end bit was especially the relation between Athens and Sparta.
Right. Well, then Athens and Sparta fought each other symbolically as well as materially over the issue of who is top dog in Greece, who most represents the best of what it is to be Greek, and in particular in regard to freedom. Now, if you're a Democrat, you consider that anything that's not democracy is unfreedom for the majority of the citizens, because it's the few rich dominating and holding, they even use the word slavery. They use that of the control that the rich few had over the many poor. So, at one level, ideological, the battle between Athens and Sparta is who is the best Greek, who most has freed Greece from Persia. Then at the next level down, it's who is in favor of the freedom of most Greeks within each city. And Sparta and its allies were typically oligarchic, and Athens and its allies were typically democratic. And they actually fought really for a combination of prestige, power, security, and wealth. I mean, all were involved in the Peloponnesian War, the great Atheno-Peloponnesian War.
Well done.
There you go. There you go, Harry. Write that in your essay, mate.
There you go, Harry. 10 out of 10.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to our questions from Waverley College. Now, in true abuse of power, the next two questions come from my old high school. I actually reached out to my ancient history teacher from high school, now 20 years ago, bloody hell. Anyway, so Paul Daly from Marcellin College, Randwick, who I have to say, I've given him a rap on the show before, but he is one of the main reasons why many kids at Marcellin studied ancient history. He is such a fantastic teacher.
Oh,
I'm hoping he still is. By all accounts, he is. But the interesting thing, pleasingly, Paul, when I spoke to him on the phone, I said, we're going to be talking to Paul Cartledge shortly. He's like, I'm looking at his book on the Spartans right now on my shelf.
Wow.
So he's an advocate of your work.
Okay.
So without any further ado, so the first question comes from Archie Daly, who's in year 12 at Marcellin College. And he's asking about the Spartans. So his question is, can you please clarify just how brutal the treatment of helots in ancient Sparta actually was? Given their importance in producing food for their Spartiate masters, wouldn't excessive brutality and random killings at the hands of the Cryptia have been counterproductive?
Yes.
It's a great question.
It's an absolutely great question. The problem is, as often, we have only one side. We have no helot sources. So we know to some extent what they did, and we know that periodically they revolted, which suggests that they weren't entirely thrilled to be slaves. But on the other hand, for very long periods, they didn't revolt, and they were the economic basis of the the Spartan state. Moreover, one way in which Spartans, like other Greeks, reinforced their sense of self as being free was to say they were not slaves. So the more slaves you control, then the more freedom, paradoxically, you can claim to have by contrast. And there is actually a source that says that is exactly how the Spartans saw it. So the issue of the treatment, yes, it's extreme. We have one particular episode in Thucydides, which involves, we're not sure when it happened, it floats free, that the Spartans made a proclamation. Any helot who feels that he has done Sparta some signal service in, and then it's very vague, the wars, so that means against either revolted allies of Sparta or enemies of Sparta, should come forward and claim their freedom. And according to the source, which is Thucydides, about 2,000 were willing to put themselves forward, and the Spartans apparently fulfilled their side of the bargain and conducted them round several shrines, religious sanctuaries in and around Sparta town, because Helots, of course, lived in the country, and they lived in Messenia as well as Laconia, on the west of Taygetos as well as east of Taygetos. They were much more remote in Messenia. And so everything seemed hunky-dory, but at night, when night fell, those 2,000 were, this is the source, massacred. And Thucydides adds, no one knows what became of them. And I suppose by that is meant whether the corpses were given back to their families, because Helots had families. God knows. Anyway, that's often used as the example that proves absolute nightmare, the Spartan-Helot relations, that they could ever do that. No wonder the Helots revolted. Now, the other side of it is steady state. And for this, we rely on Aristotle, as quoted by Plutarch, who tells us that every year when the new board of ephoroi, that means overseers, 5 of them, came into office, they're the chief executive officers of the Spartan state, in about October, they issued 2 proclamations. One was to the Spartans to shave their moustaches, so not grow upper lip facial hair, which is actually documented in sculpture. And secondly, obey the laws. So be good Spartans. That doesn't actually tell you very much. The second proclamation was a declaration of war on behalf of all the Spartans on the Helots. Now, what the point?
I just love that.
Well, the point of that is it's if you like clever. I mean, it's not nice, but what it means is that a Helot, regardless of his or her behavior or attitude, is by definition an enemy, and therefore, as today, if you go and fight in Ukraine or Russia and you kill a member of the enemy, that's not murder. It's homicide, but it's not murder. And in the same way, if you kill a Helot, male or female, you're not committing a polluting murder. Spartans are very religious and they're very anxious not to be polluted. And so this is the thinking behind. It's rather cruel, but it's pragmatic. But at the same time, what it means is that the relationship between the two, the Spartans on the one side and the Helots as a group, is unique. We don't know of another city where the unfree population is, by definition, considered at war with the free citizen population. On the other hand, what effect it would presumably have is to prevent, to stifle any kind of dissent or dissidence or let alone revolt in the ordinary course of events. You don't want to risk getting killed just for being a Helot. So it's a kind of contract. Helots work and they can become quite well off and they live in their own families, in their own villages. They're not in pens. They're not like in a Southern American slave estate. They're not under the lash of a slave driver. And they have their own leaders and they organize their own religious life, for example. They are Greeks, after all, in the same way the Spartans are Greeks. They worship the same gods and heroes and so on. So life for them was, on the one hand, not too bad. On the other hand, potentially ghastly.
Well, that's a great answer to that question. I mean, Archie, that's something for you to do a little bit of research on and to come to a conclusion on, mate. But thank you for that question. And look, the final question that we've got is also from Marcelin College in Year 12, from a student named Gino Ensol, and he asks, Paul, how important was the Battle of Thermopylae in the creation of the Spartan military mirage, and what was the actual breakdown of other Greek city-states present?
Right. Well, I haven't got in my head the breakdown of the others, but they were all allies of Sparta within the Peloponnesian League, plus people from the local area, namely Phocis. They amounted to about 6,000 to 7,000. It's often forgotten that Leonidas and his 300 were a teeny tiny minority of the 6,000 to 7,000 force in the pass at Thermopylae. As to the question, what effect or what was its place within the forming of the Spartan mirage, there had been, I believe, versions of Spartan mirage. Mirage meaning something that's not true or only partially true. It's one of these problematic terms, but it's to do with the reputation, the image of Sparta. Thermopylae was absolutely crucial for the element of it, which was we Spartans, even if the odds are absolutely overwhelmingly against us, if the cause is right, and in this case the cause is the freedom of all Greece, not just Sparta, and after all Athens is the main enemy of the Persians, not the Spartans, if the cause is right, even if the odds are stacked, we go for it and we die. Now, you, I'm sure, know, the high school student, not all the 300 actually died in Thermopylae. It's one of those facts that's generally not widely known. 3 of them didn't for different reasons, and they survived. And one of them, in the major battle of the next year, was so ashamed at having survived that he got himself killed. This is the Battle of Plataea. He behaved in a very undisciplined, un-Spartan manner, got himself killed because he was ashamed at having survived. Another one committed suicide, and so on. So it wasn't a great thing to survive, but actually people did. And so the Spartans themselves made a great deal of it. And our word Spartan, meaning austere, self-denying and soldierly, that does ultimately, at any rate, get connected to the myth. But there's much more to the Spartan myth. There's education, there's collective solidarity as opposed to individual enterprise. There is really, by normal Greek standards, the status of Spartan women is significantly higher than that of, say, Athenian women vis-a-vis their men. So the myth and the mirage has more elements than just a military or austerity dimension, though Thermopylae is crucial to that.
And I think we've comprehensively answered those questions, everyone. Thank you to everyone from both Waverley College and Marsland College, both in the same sort of area in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Great schools. We thank them for their questions, and all the best of luck for the HSC this year. We've more or less covered what we can cover. Everything that we can cover without actually reading the book.
Definitely.
What do you think, Nick?
Absolutely. Oh, we did, and a little bit extra. So thank you to those students. We got a bit more insights on Spartans and stuff. So
and when the book
that was
comes
brilliant,
out,
Paul.
You will get a copy, and you'll get a proof copy before the actual published copy. So you can have a privilege.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Fantastic.
Thank
Amazing.
you for having
Thank
me.
you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Paul, it's our pleasure, mate, and thank you for coming on again. Look, it's amazing for me and Tom. I'm mesmerised just listening to your story, and usually when we switch off this, me and Tom will recap, but look, we're going to be blown away with this.
Because every time we speak to Paul, there's a part of me that is still sitting in that auditorium at Marsland College watching him speak in that documentary, the Greeks' Crucible of Civilization, with Liam Neeson's narration and all that sort of thing. So that feeling is never lost on me. So it genuinely is an honor to have you be part of this and continue to be educating not just us, but also these students that are and teachers who are listening into the show as well. So Paul, thank you so much.
Definitely.
Thank you both. Have a great evening.
Well, guys, ouzotalk@outlook.com is the email. Follow us on social media at Ouzo Talk and at Ouzo_Talk on Instagram, also on YouTube. Nick Athanasiou, Professor Paul Cartledge. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Beautiful. Well said. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Ouzo Talk is produced, written and presented by Tom Skolarikis and Nick Athanasiou. Our theme music is written and played by Peter Apostolidis, with additional music from George Kalapidis and Bouzouki legend Thanasis Polykadriotis.
Ακολουθήστε μας στο Soundees, στο Spotify, στο Apple Podcasts και στο Google Podcasts.